many of you like the one long interview that I conduct with Alexander Mercouris every Wednesday, which take about 1.5 hours. But you like it, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to post that one on Wednesday. I normally conduct an interview in the morning, and I'll try to do it sometime in the afternoon to get it out, and with very minimum editing. And after that, I'll cut them out based on the topics. And if needed, I'll add a little bit more footage, maybe picture, maybe subtitle, etc., a little bit more detailed. So if there's a certain part of the interview you'd like to see again, you can do it on Thursdays and Fridays. I'll gradually post them. In that way, you're not going to have any time to do anything else. You just spend time watching my program, which would be great. So here's this Wednesday's interview I have with Alexander Mercouris. We talked about China, about Russia, the Ukraine war, the Middle East. And at the end of it, we also discuss why some women politicians are even more hawkish than men. Enjoy.
By the way, is that it's an extraordinary thing? Is this the Summer Palace?
Yes, it is the newly
Yes.
built. After they burned down the old Summer Palace, and
Yeah.
Cixi, she built the new one. The money's supposed to go to the Navy, the Chinese
That's right.
Navy.
That's
Yeah,
right.
she she put in her own Summer Palace. But the good thing about that is we get to see a Summer Palace, right? The
That's
royal
right.
summer the royal Summer Palace.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
So yes,
How do you pronounce her name?
her
Because it's
name
very
is
difficult.
Cixi.
Sisi.
Yeah, yeah,
Sisi. Yes.
yeah.
And I was told that it means the Empress of the West because she sat on the western part of the palace. Is that what it
Her
means?
her
Cersei.
Cixi is her name,
It's
or
her name,
I guess her official name.
official name.
But
Yeah.
the reason she's also being called the West, the palace, because after her
Mm,
son died, I mean, after her
mm,
husband died,
mm.
the emperor died. So she and the queen, she wasn't the queen or the empress, the
No.
official empress, but she's the mother of the new emperor. So the two
Mm,
of them was the one behind that emperor, the new emperor, who was very young. And one
right.
is living in the East Palace, and she's living in the
Uh,
West Palace.
oh,
So
I
that
see. Gosh.
was,
Okay.
yeah,
That
that
was
was the
that was,
reason.
that was the reason.
Yeah.
Gosh. Gosh. And I remember you telling me that your grandmother was born when she was still alive. When
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah.
mean, astonishing to think that within the generation of one person, the life
Hmm.
of one person,
Yeah.
China has changed so
So
much.
much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my grandmother had a remarkable life. Just the simple fact that she
Yeah.
was born
Yeah.
1899 and that she died in
1999.
2000. So she
Yeah.
crossed the three
Mm,
millenniums, right? So
mm,
yeah,
mm.
that was a very turbulent time. A lot of things happened in China. So yes,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. I'm
Talking
ready.
talking about turbulence. And so Taiwan had an election. I have to say, I'm not convinced that this guy is, you can call it a democratically elected, considering there's only 70% of the voter voted. And out of that
Yeah.
70%, he got 40% of the vote. So eventually, we can say 28% of people who are eligible to vote supported him. But
Yeah.
the West would call him democratically elected.
Mm,
But in his speech, it's unusually, I would say, unfriendly. I would say provocative,
mm,
because not only he's saying the name, okay, the Republic of China, which is the official constitutional name of Taiwan. He's saying that, yeah, we, the Republic of China, Taiwan, or Taiwan. He's essentially saying you can call yourself all
mm,
these, which is unconstitutional, and
mm,
certainly China, the mainland China, doesn't accept that. Not only he said that, he also said that the two sides, the mainland and the Taiwan, does not have any affiliation, which is clear declaration of independence, in my
mm,
view, right? That's how,
mm.
I mean, how do you interpret that? So
I
he's very,
complete.
go ahead.
Go on. No, no, go on. Well, just to say, I completely agree. I think that the secessionist movement in Taiwan is becoming more provocative all the time. I completely agree also that there's no reason to think that this election is any more secure than other elections in American vassal states tend to be nowadays. I
Yeah.
say that because it's absolutely clear that the United States is working now, undoubtedly, towards the secession of Taiwan. And they will want in Taiwan. Well, let's call it Taiwan. They will
Hmm.
want in Taiwan somebody who will move forward with that secession process. I mean, I think that is absolutely clear. This is what this election was all about. I ought to have sent it to you, but I only read it just before we did this program. A terrifying article in the Daily Mail, which is one of our newspapers here in Britain, which spoke with incredibly approving way about how US Marines are now training on Philippine islands,
Hmm.
including one which is within sight of Taiwan. And it was straightforwardly said in this article that they're training for war with China and war with China when Taiwan achieves, as they put it, achieves independence from China. So I think that this is madness on a extraordinary scale, but clearly this is the agenda, and clearly this is the rhetoric this person is engaging in. What I suspect with the election, by the way, is that you probably find that there were all kinds of votes probably cast against him, which simply
Hmm.
weren't counted or were lost,
Hmm.
that kind of
Yeah.
thing. That's
Yeah.
the
Yes.
way these
Yeah.
things are done. Because
Yeah.
at a time of such crisis, I find it difficult, actually. I mean, I appreciate 70% turnout in the West would
Hmm.
seem high, but
Hmm.
I would have thought that in a place like Taiwan, you would expect a much higher turnout than this. So I suspect that methods have been found to make sure that the people who would have voted against this man their votes weren't counted. It's as
Yeah.
simple as that.
Yeah, definitively. And the way they counted, etc. Yeah, they're the same the same tactic you've seen in
Yeah.
other places to
Mm.
secure. Yes. But actually, that's my question because clearly his speech is either get the U.S. approval or U.S. probably participated in crafting that speech, right? So you're thinking that you believe that U.S. do want him, Taiwan, to be more to going forward with this independence things to provoke China to have a real war? Is that where? Because there's another possibility is that the US is very angry seeing Xi Jinping's visit to Europe and then, of course, Putin's visit
Mm.
to Beijing. And the way that the US revenge for this whole thing is to throw a tantrum just to make China feel bad. So let him say some hawkish thing, not necessarily means that they're going to seriously do something. But you think there's more into it, more to that than
I
just the
think there is.
surface.
I
Okay.
think there is. I think, unfortunately, that there is. I mean, I think that there is an element of tantrum and anger in the US about this. But the underlying problem, the reason we are in this crisis is because of this terror the United States has that it's about to lose its hegemony. Now, why it is so important for United States to retain its hegemony is another question. I mean, we've discussed this already. I mean, this hegemony is doing nothing for the American people. It's simply leading them into a disaster and a potentially disastrous war with China, which is something which is an insane thing to do.
Mhm.
But I'm now reading more and more articles. I suspect, by the way, that the British media is even more outspoken about this than the American in some ways. But
Mhm.
I see more and more articles which are clearly leading us in that direction. There was an article by a man called Eldridge Colby in the Financial Times. Now, he is the son, as it turns out, of a former director of the CIA, a fact I wasn't aware of. And he is absolutely part of the foreign policy establishment in the United States. And he was in charge of framing the US's 2018 national defense policy. So, they're talking a very, very important person. When you read that article in the Financial Times, what he's on the one hand telling to the Europeans is, look, you've got to, we can't be strong everywhere. We can't be strong in Europe. You've got to look after your own defenses. Russia is your problem. It isn't really our problem. And then, calamitously, he goes on to say, China is our problem. That is the adversary we must line up against. China is the biggest economy in the world, except for our own. Actually, it's probably bigger, but anyway, the Americans won't want to admit that. Asia is the more economically important region, more important now than Europe is. So America's priority is to prepare for a war with China. And that's, it's set out very clearly there. Now, of course, the Americans are always careful, but this is a very thin pretense to make it appear that this is going to be, they want to make it look like it's a war of aggression on China's part against Taiwan, the democracy in Taiwan, which the United States is going to come to the rescue of. But of course, the reality is, and it's exactly the same playbook I remember in Ukraine, provocation upon provocation leading to this conflict. And in Ukraine, we saw an endless succession of broken promises, a failure to resolve agreements to resolve the civil war in that country, preparations for an armed attack on the regions in the eastern Ukraine that were seeking at one time autonomy from the Ukrainian government. Events that eventually left the Russians feeling that they had no option but to intervene militarily. And we see the same process with Taiwan. Provocation after provocation directed towards China, an attempt to prepare the West and the American people for the view that China is the aggressor in this conflict, an aggressor with respect to its own territory. I mean, just remember this, Taiwan is recognized as a part of China. Just saying. Yeah. But anyway, endless attempts to do that. And I think that the United States is preparing the ground for a conflict with China, which it is intending to provoke. And I have to say that, to me, this isn't just irrational. It is outright mad. But that is what they're doing, and that's how they're acting.
It's very good you bring this up. I read that article too. This Albridge Colby, right? I think his father's name is William Colby. That's the CIA director. Yeah.
That's right.
But I actually read something about him because I'm curious. They characterize it, Political had an article about him not that long ago. They actually characterize him and the people like him as realist.
Yeah.
What is the realist about that? I don't understand that. The whole thing about realist is that he wants the U.S. to redirect their resource go to China, rather than tied up in Ukraine. Not only that, the article he didn't say, okay, let's just stop all the war in Ukraine. He's saying, Europe, you can continue to fight, right? We, the United States, we need to focus on China. Yeah. Isn't there his name for it? It's called the World War III. Isn't that what he's saying here?
Well, there's nothing realistic about this. This isn't realism. This is redefining the concept of realism in a way that it makes it the opposite of what it actually is. The only part of his article where there is a glimmer of connection to reality is when he says that the United States cannot be strong everywhere. So the United States doesn't have the resources to take on China and Russia at one and the same time. That's what he's saying. And he's saying, as you correctly said to the Europeans, look, no, you're not that important anymore. Let's face it. You've got to face on the Russians themselves. We got to deal with the Chinese. That is the greater challenge for us. Now that in Washington passes for realism, saying that, that our resources are not infinite. In every other respect is mad. I mean, it's not realism in the way that, say, someone like Professor John Mearsheimer would define realism. Professor Mearsheimer, people like him, say, look, you conduct your foreign policy. You seek to protect always your core national interests. Obviously, you do. And you look at what your resources are, and you aim above all to maintain peace. Because without peace, I mean, there is nothing. But that isn't what Mr. Colby and people like him are about. I mean, he's in no sense a realist at all. What was fascinating, by the way, about that article is to see the response from the various people who penned comments to it in the the thread in the Financial Times, and they're all Europeans, and they're all furious, and they said, "How dare you put China as the greater enemy than Russia? We must be equally aggressive towards both of them at the same time." So I mean, this is the type of debate that is conducted in the West. It is between two mad people. One group, one person is totally mad and completely disconnected from the reality. The other, in a way, is equally mad, but does have just this little glimmer of reality about one or two things, and that's enough to get him called a realist.
But if we do follow what he's saying is, okay, you, the Europeans, you can continue the war in Ukraine.
No.
We will start a war here with China. Isn't that World War III? I mean, that's
No, it is.
basically
It's
what
World
it
War
is.
Three. It's absolutely well. I mean, I should say, by the way, it's unrealistic at two levels. Firstly, it is unrealistic at the great level because what he's talking about is we should aim for World War III with China, which is what it would be. I mean, it would be a. By the way, a war of a kind that the United States is psychologically completely unprepared for. They have been prepared for a war with the Soviets since the 1940s, but it would have been a ground war far away from American territory with all the seas in between. This would be a naval war. And that is very different. And conceptually, the United States has no understanding of that because it's had this maritime dominance until very recently. And it's never imagined that it would be facing up against a naval power equal to itself. And by the way, with a naval tradition far older than itself. Just saying. So but that is one. That's the grand unrealism of this. The other part, by the way, the equation that the Europeans can take care of Russia all by themselves and win the war in Ukraine by themselves actually is also unrealistic. The reality is that the Europeans are completely unable to take on the Russians, either each country individually or all of them working collectively. I think that's been demonstrated conclusively now. And they certainly can't win the war in Ukraine for it without the help of the United States. Even with the help of the United States, they're losing the war. But without the United States, it's absolute game over, as everybody knows.
Yeah, and then if the Europeans are left alone, I mean, they probably won't accept. It seems like they won't accept that the total defeat by Russia by the Uranian. But that will lead them to do something extreme, isn't it? That's something also is a possibility that they will probably strike inside Russia. I mean, there's some talking about that already, and talking about nuclear arm going to Poland and stuff like that. It's just very dangerous to me, like what they're talking about.
It is insanely dangerous, and I use both words carefully because it's dangerous, but it is also insane because what the United States ought to be doing if it really wanted to do what Mr. Colby says it should do, which is withdraw from Europe and focus on China instead. It should be settling the conflict with Russia. It should be picking up the phone to the Russians and saying, "Look, we can't continue. We understand that you're going to win the war. It's going to be very embarrassing and difficult for us. But at the same time, if you win the war, you're going to have problems of your own. So let's sit down and come to some kind of agreement and see how we can limit the damage and come to an understanding with each other that will provide peace in Europe." If you just say to the Europeans, "Look, we're going away because we're going to fight the Chinese instead, and you're left alone to deal with the Russians," the Europeans are going to freak out because they know they can't take on the Russians, and they know that they're going to lose in Ukraine without the United States. And they also know, the political class in Europe, that their entire future now depends on the United States also. And if the United States gradually withdraws from the scene, especially if Russian influence in Europe starts to grow, that their own positions would be in extreme jeopardy. So what they would do in that kind of situation is that they would try to escalate the war in Ukraine. They would launch missile strikes against Russian territory. They'd start sending European troops to Ukraine. And they're not going to do that because they think that they can defeat the Russians by themselves. They're going to do that because they hope to put the United States in a position where it is dragged back to Europe in order to rescue them. And you can see the rhetoric that's coming out from Europe is exactly that. The Baltic states, who are very vulnerable, already talking about sending their soldiers to Europe. Macron, again, talking this time, he's now talking about sending, causing missile strikes against positions in Europe. That sort of thing. So if the United States does what Mr. Colby says, the situation in Europe will not be minded for him by the Europeans. The situation in Europe will get out of control, and the United States could find itself facing a very difficult choice. Does it get sucked back in, risking a confrontation with the Russians, which is who are a nuclear power, or does it simply write Europe off, which no American official is prepared to do?
Yeah. And we haven't talked about the Middle East. the US will be all over the place, everywhere. that okay. Before we go there,
Well, before we proceed, there's a very famous quote from a very famous European leader, statesman, who is Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was not only a tremendous political leader, he was a political genius, but he was also a great military leader as well. And he once said, "He who defends everything defends nothing." And that is exactly what the United States is trying to do at the moment.
Yeah. Now, Mearsheimer, I actually think he's a realist, but he also thinks China is the threat. He actually thought about that, but he's more realistic about that. He did say that we should not provoke Taiwan, but put more resource to focus on how to deal with China. Now, I think he also talked about that probably on the Duran with your guys or maybe somewhere else. He has said that before the election, it's good. It will be good for the Biden administration to not stir up anything in Taiwan, to keep it as it is. But it doesn't seem like, I mean, with that kind of a speech, that doesn't seem like the thinking of the Biden administration. I mean, why would they want this new leader in Taiwan to have that kind of a speech if they really want to keep the status quo at least until the November, right? So what do you think?
Right, let me just quickly talk about Professor Mearsheimer, who I know. I mean, I've done many programs with him. I mean, I've never met him person to person, but I think I understand his mind. He is deeply patriotic American. He is somebody who's very keen on America preserving its national interests, defending its national interests, and he sees China as a rival. I mean, makes no secret about that. He sees China as a rival. He does see China, I think, as a potential threat. This, however, and I've spoken to him in person about this, comes alongside a very, very great respect and in some ways an admiration for China, which I've experienced myself. So he wants rivalry with China, competition with China. He wants a very hard, tough American policy towards China. But he absolutely does not want war. He wants a rivalry, in other words, with China, which I would describe as a rather softer version of the rivalry which existed between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. In other words, a situation where the two countries are neither friends nor enemies exactly, but they're adversaries. Not quite as bad as it was during the Cold War with China, but they're adversaries. They maneuver constantly against each other, but they do so in a type of equilibrium in which each side respects the core interests of the other. And on that, of course, he recognizes that China has a particular interest in Taiwan. Now, you may agree with that policy, or you might not. I personally think that this is unnecessary. I don't think there's any reason to get into that kind of relationship with China either. I think, on the contrary, there is no reason why China and the United States should not be friends. Just saying. That's my own personal view. But, I can understand that from a person who believes in great power politics and great power competition, as Professor Mearsheimer does. And I do find that outlook both historically based and rational from a Western point of view. He is speaking from within the Western tradition of statecraft. The Chinese tradition, which is to look for consensus, is different. Now, the thing to understand about the Biden administration is that it is not rational in that way. And I think that is where I think he gets it wrong. I mean, I don't blame him, because I have repeatedly got this wrong myself. I've said in the past also that it didn't make any sense that the West, that the United States should want to get into a conflict with Russia over Ukraine. That's what I believed. I said many times that it makes no sense for the United States to get into a conflict with China over Taiwan. I've said at various times, not so much in this election, but this election cycle, but in other election cycles, that the very last thing you want to do in an election in the United States is draw the United States into a great power war. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. The thing I have repeatedly discovered is that the people who hold power in Washington, and especially those who are powerful within this administration, think in a completely different way. Now, winning the election is obviously for them important, but defeating China is more important still. It is, in fact, their fundamental and overriding obsession and concern. And what I suspect is happening is that the signals from Donald Trump and his team are, to put it mildly, very mixed. And that's being optimistic about it. They're probably saying to themselves, well, we got a president who is extremely hardline on everything and who wants to confront China in every way he can, and who is as rude about Xi Jinping at every single opportunity. So he might not be president for very much longer. So let's move this agenda along forward as fast as we possibly can before he goes, so that if the next president, who may be Donald Trump, decides to change the policy towards China, he finds that he cannot do so. So I think this is what is actually happening.
They want to they want to set the course already, get this started already. Yeah.
Yes.
And whoever is the next president, including Biden himself, right?
Yeah.
He won't be able to do anything afterwards.
That's right.
Now, the war and the election I find interesting. I'm not so sure. If you look at the past history, like Bush, W. Bush, he was doing poorly, in the war in Iraq, but he was still reelected. And Obama, he openly said he wanted to be a war president, and he did. He opened a new front. Okay, he opened a new war, even though he was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was reelected. And even Nixon. Now Nixon's Watergate was after he was reelected, even though the Vietnam War was going poorly, but he was also reelected. So I just wonder, it seems like the electorate, the people who are voting, they seems reluctant in the middle of a war to change. They call them, the president is the commander in chief. Is there some elements of that? Do you think?
Undoubtedly there is. In fact, there's even a film that came out in the United States about 20 years ago. You probably remember it, called Wag the Dog, which is on precisely this issue that, a president in trouble, how does he get himself out of trouble? By inventing a war somewhere. And in that case, it was a purely imaginary war, But of course, you can't really create imaginary wars. You have to create real ones. I think there's a strong element of this that, you create a situation in the United States of war psychosis. And of course, it's useful in so many ways.
Mhm.
Firstly, you can say that your opponent is unpatriotic and is on the side of the enemy if he criticizes you. And you can also use the war in order to enhance your power as president and that of the executive in all sorts of ways. You can lean on social media to restrict the views of your opponents and your critics. You can get your friends in the media more easily to block off what they're going to say. You can control the discussions and you control the debate, and it can work to your advantage. And it did that for Nixon, and it did that for Obama, as you said, and for George W. Bush, and it could very well do that for Biden too. If Biden loses the election, it's not going to be because of the wars or because of his foreign policy. It's because of the economic conditions that most Americans find themselves in. There is an element within US society which is opposed to these wars and which is tired of them and wants them to end. And it is getting bigger, but it is very, very far from being a critical mass at the moment.
Yeah, and going back to the Ukraine war here, we just talked about it, right? There's all kinds of provocations. This, it's always sometimes I feel like the smaller countries like Estonia, the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, right? She's the one who's calling on collective response, which is to me means NATO should get in, and the Duda, the Polish president, want the nuclear he called nukes in Poland to deter Russia. I mean, how can that deter Russia? And then Blinken and Stoltenberg both said that there should be a strike inside Russia using NATO weapons. And their argument is, okay, once those weapons given to Ukraine, those are Ukraine weapons. You can feel free to do whatever you want. So all these, to me, a very dangerous thing. And the Russian did responded with all this, conducted a tactical nuclear weapon drill. What every time I notice every time when I thought the war is ending, something happens, whether there's new injection of cash or new more advanced weapons or very provocative talking, etc. So there's powerful forces do not want this war to end. Is that right?
Absolutely. They want to escalate it. And yesterday, over the course of a press conference, President Putin of Russia, gave the strongest warning he has ever given to the West. He actually spoke about unending escalation. And that's what he said. I mean, he used those very words. He said that what we're getting from the West is unending escalation. And he said, do these people understand how dangerous this is? And he said, if they go on with this course, well, we're not just going to sit back if they start launching missiles at us. And he went and discussed the various technical features of each of the missiles that have been talked about, the British missiles and the French missiles and the American missiles. And he said, this claim that these are going to be Ukrainian weapons makes absolutely no sense, because the way in which these missiles operate, they can only operate if they are provided with the guidance and the technical support of these Western countries, Britain, France, and of the United States. And he said that Russia will not sit back and let it happen. It cannot allow that situation to arise. It will have to respond. He didn't say exactly how, but he gave a very clear warning. He said that countries in Europe need to understand how dangerous the situation is. Some of the smaller ones need to understand that they have dense populations. And what he was basically saying is that if there's missile strikes, or indeed, God help us, nuclear strikes, I mean, they will not survive because there is no reason for them to do so. And he actually said something really quite extraordinary. He said, if Europe finds itself in this situation, in that kind of conflict with Russia, then the United States will be left with a very difficult choice. Does it intervene in this conflict, given that Russia possesses nuclear strategic parity? So, I mean, the warning he's given could not be clearer. And he even said at one point, do they want the conflict to go global? And, we come back to this threat that he made, not threat, I think, warning that he made about a couple of weeks ago, in which the Russians warned the British that if the British missiles are launched against Russia, the Russians will feel free to retaliate against British military facilities anywhere in the world. And of course, we know that American military facilities are present in a great many places around the world, not just in the continental United States. So Putin gave this very, very clear warning. And is it the big headline story in the media in the West? Are people being informed about it? Do you read the New York Times with editorials and op-eds about this? Do the BBC and CBS and all of these places feature it? There's been complete silence. It's as if Putin is talking to himself. Well, of course, he's not talking to himself. He is the leader of a nuclear power, a major nuclear power. And he's given, I think, the most stark warning I've ever seen a political leader do ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. But there we are. I mean, it's incredible to me that this isn't talked about or discussed in the way it should be.
Yeah, that's the strange thing about our media, right? When there is some serious things that they need to talk about, they don't. They talking very hawkish, they use all kinds of threatened language towards Russia, demeaning language, et cetera, to provoke Russia. They are fine with saying all those kind of things. Calling Xi Jinping, is calling Putin, calling everybody dictators and those kind of things. They're totally okay talking. But now there's a real sign of things can go bad, really go really bad. They don't talk about it, right? They don't.
No.
They pretend it never happened. They don't say anything. It's so strange. I find that the media, on the one hand, they seem to like to see conflict, but then when there is a real possibility of a real bad conflict, then they don't talk about it. It's so bizarre to me.
It is utterly bizarre, but there is an explanation for it, which is, of course, that if the American people and the people of Germany, France, and Britain were informed about the risks their leaders are taking, then they probably would react. I mean, I'm sure most people do not want to be in a situation when missiles and potentially nuclear bombs and nuclear missiles are flying from one end of the world to the other, and we are in a World War III situation. The only way the Western leaders can continue with these policies is by concealing what they are doing from their own people. And if you want to understand whether there is democracy in the West or not, then that tells you more clearly than anything else that on this fundamental issue, there is none.
Yeah, that's also how I feel. Yeah. There's going to be this peace conference that's been talked about in Switzerland. Is that next month, I believe?
Yeah.
So the Ukrainians made a big deal out of it. They are inviting 160 countries. Now 90 of them already declined, including China. And even, I mean, they didn't invite Russia, which totally meaningless to me. Okay, you're talking about a conflict, but one side you're not inviting. And Russia said they're not going to sending anyone, involved whatsoever. And China kind of like softly declined it. In my view, they said they haven't worked out any details. For now, they don't have anybody or something like that. Was very mild, I think, decline. Even Biden said he's not coming. Yeah. So what they are trying to achieve? What's the goal here? Is it just optics, totally optics?
Well, it's actually I'm glad you've asked this question, because it's very difficult to understand what the objective of this conference was. Now, back in August of last year, at the height of Ukraine's offensive, the United States basically sponsored a meeting which actually took place in Saudi Arabia, which seems to have been, the sort of seed for this particular conference. And in fact, there was a whole series of meetings in which Western governments, plus Ukraine, plus certain countries in the global south, including China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil, got together, and the Americans tried to push all of these countries to accept a peace proposal, as it's represented to be, by President Zelensky. Now, President Zelensky's peace proposal is it's completely unrealistic. It wants Russia to withdraw completely from Ukraine, accept Ukrainian sovereignty, agree to pay Ukraine reparations, agreed to the arrest and prosecution of its leaders for war crimes. And then once all that's done, there will be some kind of negotiations between between Ukraine and Russia about, well, I'm not quite sure what exactly. But I mean, I'm only very slightly, I'm only making this look slightly more absurd than it really is. It is that kind of proposal. But that was this proposal that, they were going to discuss in August last year. Because in August last year, the expectations were that Ukraine was going to succeed in its counteroffensive and would win the war. So there was a kind of diplomatic sense there, because you'd say if Ukraine achieves a military victory, then you can bring all these countries together, you can put this proposal, you can get those countries to agree to it, because Ukraine looks like it's going to win the war, and then it can be presented as a united global response to the Russians, and that will be a kind of ultimatum to them from the entire world community to capitulate and to come to terms with Ukraine. That was the plan then. But of course, things have turned out completely otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So why have they persisted with this process and gone ahead with this conference in Switzerland, to which the heads of state and heads of government are invited? And I have real difficulty understanding why. I don't think many people do. And I think what basically happened was that the Ukrainians got very, very committed to this. They thought that this would be the way to try to win, in some diplomatic way, what they've basically lost on the battlefronts.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody came up with the idea that the people to organize this conference would be the Swiss, because Switzerland is supposed to be this neutral country. And the Russians would be invited, but they wouldn't actually be invited. They'd be told to come along and hang around in Geneva in various hotels. And then when the conferences ended, they'd be asked to come and join, when they'd be presented with the finished document, which would be the consensus of every country, of all the countries that participated. And of course, the Russians said, "No way, we're not involved. We're not going to send anybody. This is nothing. This makes absolutely no sense to us." And Switzerland is not behaving like a neutral country. And from the moment that happened, it's difficult to understand why they continued with this conference at all. And more countries, as you rightly say, are staying away. Important leaders are staying away. President Biden, who I think senses that this is turning into a debacle, has decided to stay away. And I think the only reason why this is continuing at all is because the Ukrainians themselves got incredibly committed to it. There's a story circulating, and I want to stress it's a story. I don't know how true it is, but the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov mentioned it and seemed to say that it probably was true, that he'd been heard that it was true, that there was a meeting in April between Zelensky and Western diplomats, in which the Western diplomats appear to have tried to tell Zelensky, look, this conference in Switzerland is falling apart. You must make some concessions to the Russians if you're going to try and persuade anybody to come, or perhaps we should call off this conference entirely. And apparently he went into a massive tantrum. Lavrov said it was an astonishing display, but that's Lavrov, but it seems plausible enough. And anyway, he refused and insisted that the conference go ahead. And presumably that's why it's going ahead. And now he's very upset and very angry because Biden isn't going.
I mean, as it looks now, it's going to be very disappointing, right? I don't think it will generate anything. And then after that is the NATO will have a meeting in Washington, I believe, follow this peace conference, which I'm sure will be another disappointment for Ukraine because they want to join NATO. I don't think they will be allowed to join NATO in that meeting either. Don't you think that they won't be in Washington?
Well, the United States and Germany have publicly said that Ukraine is not going to join NATO at this meeting. And in fact, the German Chancellor Scholz, has come forward and said that he's not sure when Ukraine will join NATO. And he sort of seemed to suggest it might even take 30 years before it does. It's very crushing for Ukraine. But, I mean, at least that spells out the reality. I think these constant attempts to talk Ukraine into having these hopes is very cruel. My friend Brian Beletic says that what the West is doing basically is holding out various hopes to Ukraine about missile attacks on Russia, European troops to Ukraine, diplomatic initiatives that will go nowhere, basically in order to keep Ukraine fighting, at least until the November elections. And I think he's probably at some level right. And of course, all that's doing is that more Ukrainians are dying every single day. More damage is being done. I read an absolutely horrifying article in The Guardian in which I discovered something I didn't know, that half the population of Ukraine is now suffering from PTSD. Half. And, the cruelty of this is just beyond expression. But apparently it goes on, and it will go on at least until November and perhaps even beyond.
That's pure evil, because of election in the US, they keep on letting the Ukrainian die, knowing full well they're not going to let Ukraine into NATO, but they're dangling this thing right in front of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have to say, I mean, all the things that we were discussing before, war with China, war with Russia, I mean, it's mad. Though all those things are mad and evil as well. But this is not quite so mad, but it is extremely evil as well. It is very wicked. What they're doing is heartless and incredibly cruel. If they're not going to intervene to help Ukraine, then they should simply say so. If they can't help Ukraine to win, they should tell Ukraine to negotiate. And if they're not prepared to have Ukraine in NATO, then they should tell Ukraine that. I mean, there's no point in prolonging this agony in the way that they're doing, in the way that causing the results that they're causing. And if it's as cynical as Brian Beletic thinks, then all I can say is, I mean, this is one of the worst things I've ever encountered, one of the darkest moments I've ever known.
Not only they don't, they dangle the thing like trying to let the Ukraine continue to fight. If anybody say anything, right, you should convince them to negotiate, then you will be characterized as a Russia puppet, right?
Yeah.
So they even dismiss the people who are actually wanted to end this conflict, which ultimately is the good thing for Ukraine if you can end this conflict quickly.
Yeah.
But they discredit those people.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I've been called that myself. I mean, there've been petitions to get me thrown off YouTube because I've been calling them these. I mean, every one of us who says these things gets called that. And by the way, just for you to know, I recently called a puppet of C as well. Chairman C. He was the person referred to him as, which I found really quite funny, actually.
Yeah, in the Chinese media also, if you are sympathize with, if you want to end the war in Ukraine, they would characterize you as the puppet, Russian puppet, and they will always say, okay, glory goes, Ukraine has the glory. What does that even mean?
Well, it doesn't.
Ukraine can have all the glory it wants, but the meantime, they're losing territory, they're losing people.
Yeah.
So what does that even mean? Glory goes to the Ukraine, right?
Well, it's. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's a Ukrainian, a fascist Ukrainian slogan, by the way, which dates to the Second World War. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. It was part of, made famous by the fascist movement. But no one needs a country of dead heroes. That's what you would get. I mean, it's not really heroism. It's the kind of heroism that the SS in Germany had. Even as they were, being annihilated and were annihilating others. It's pure nihilism of the most, as I said, terrible sort. As a Greek, I mean, the word hero is a Greek one. I could say absolutely, this is not what heroism. It does not correspond with the Greek conception of the word hero in any way, which is, by the way, from what I've read of Chinese literature, not so different than the Chinese conception of what true courage and heroism also is, which always has a very strong moral component to it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, being a hero actually doesn't mean you just keep on fighting. That doesn't mean that. It means when it's time for you to, for example, apologize, you have the courage to apologize, to admit mistakes, right?
Absolutely.
And I mean that lots of time that's the hardest thing to admit that you're wrong. Okay, that this war is wrong. I mean, could have been avoided.
Correct. That's entirely right. I mean, but that requires moral courage, which, as I said, in China, absolutely, if you know anything at all about Chinese history, I'm not just talking about Chinese literature now, but Chinese history, it is an absolutely fundamental quality that is profoundly there in Chinese culture. I mean, going all the way back, to the time of the Warring States and the philosophers of that time. Moral courage, the ability to face reality, to speak truth, to tell people who are more powerful than yourself what is the truth, and to make just and humane decisions based upon it. That is the real quality of the hero, not the kamikaze warrior, which is what the Japanese were doing during the Second World War, which is another example of the false heroism that we're talking about, the corrupt heroism that we're talking about.
In Chinese history, it's interesting. One of the emperor 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty, Han Wudi, he is very famous for fighting the more territories and then defending the border. I mean, he's very famous for being a real warrior. Okay, during his time, but he also famously he made mistakes toward the end of later in his life, and he actually wrote an apology. Imagine that, an emperor. He wrote an apology. He listed all the mistakes he made to spread it to the whole country. He apologized to the people. He said, I made these mistakes. Those are my mistakes, and I apologize for that. I find that's pretty stunning. Imagine any leaders today doing that. I find that's pretty extraordinary.
Absolutely. I mean, well, I mean, that kind of humility and self-awareness and humanity and compassion does not exist, and sense of responsibility, by the way, as well. That does not exist in the West today. And when we talk about responsibility, responsibility is a key aspect, or is supposed to be a key aspect of democracy. So the fact that there's no sense of it today, again, calls into question how far the West can be described as democratic anymore. It looks like Han Di was a more democratic emperor than any of the leaders of the West are now.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I also want to ask
Woody,
you,
Woody, Woody. I think
Di,
you call
Hang
him
Di,
Woody.
yeah, 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 Di,
Yeah,
yes, Hang
Woody.
Di, yeah, he's very famous, yeah,
Yeah.
Um, so the other thing I want to ask you, the UN, they declared July 11th, the Srebrenica massacre Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
It's proposed by no other country than Germany, which they
Yeah.
did, massacre of the Jewish
Mm.
people during World War II. Why do they do that? I mean, I don't know exactly what happened on Srebrenica
No.
at that time, but there is
Yeah.
some dispute about the number of people being killed. Some
Yeah.
people saying 8,000. But right now we have an ongoing genocide in Gaza, and we don't declare any kind of a Remembrance Day. We don't even
No.
try to stop it. Okay, and throughout the history, there has been rape of Nanking, with 300,000 people died on the low estimate. And
Yeah.
of course, the Turkish genocide against Armenia. There's plenty of genocide happened. Why did they pick on this particular thing? What's the reason?
To embarrass China. That was the primary purpose of it. Xi Jinping has just been to Belgrade, to Serbia. The Serbs are, of course, blamed for the Srebrenica massacre. China has taken a strong position on the issue of Gaza. It's put together. I mean, we were talking about this crazy peace conference, this absurd peace conference in Geneva over Ukraine. China looks like it's preparing a real diplomatic initiative involving Brazil. There's been a very important meeting between the Chinese and the Brazilians agreeing a joint position on peace in Ukraine. The Arab League has taken up the idea, first floated by Wang Yi, for an international peace conference to resolve the situation in the Middle East. So they want to embarrass China by raking up this issue of Srebrenica again and saying, look, Xi Jinping, he goes and shakes the hands of the leader of a country that committed genocide, just 20 years ago, whenever it was, 30 years ago. And at the same time, they want to counter Chinese criticism of the ongoing and actual genocide that is being conducted in Gaza. Now, I have to say straight away that this diplomatic ploy was a complete failure. Most countries in the world either voted against it or abstained.
Mm-hmm.
Only a minority of countries actually ended up supporting this proposal. So instead of actually signaling the West's disapproval of Serbia and what happened in Srebrenica, and ultimately embarrassing China, what the West again demonstrated is that the narrative of world events, of recent events, that it is so committed to, is losing traction. I think this is a major embarrassment, and it's probably the reason why this vote attracted almost no attention in the media in Britain.
Okay, so even even in Britain, they didn't pay much attention. Yeah,
No,
they know how embarrassing
no,
this is, I guess.
yeah.
Okay. Now, is there some elements of racist against the Slavic people?
Yes.
I feel like in Europe, like all the white people are not really equal. I do feel like there's a hostile feeling towards this Slavic in general. Remember Madeleine Albright, right? It was Gonzalo Lira mentioned this, that when she went back to her, I guess her native country, was somewhere, was it she was signing, there was a book signing something, and there were people from Serbia, some people was protesting her because her role played for the bombing of the Belgrade. She was in the Czech Republic, I think, and then so some people ran in, and Madeleine Albright said something, oh, those Serbs, it was like a detest of those people. It was very obvious how much she hated those people.
Yeah.
So is there some racist element in there?
There is indeed, absolutely, and it's very old, and there are many causes to it. Firstly, I should explain that the Slavs, as a group of nationalities, a linguistic, and if you like, loosely connected ethnic group, are the largest single group in Europe. They're about 40% of the population of Europe is Slav. So I mean, we're talking about a very large proportion of the culture and people of Europe. So that's the first thing to say about this. And that has created, by the way, historically, a certain nervousness in that if the Slavs ever do come together and sort out their problems and work together in a concerted way, not as they did during the period of the Soviet Union when the Western Slav states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all the rest, were basically forced into an alliance with Russia. But, an actual real coming together of the Slavs, well, that would be a major block. That would be a colossal block inside Europe. So there is that concern. But there is undoubtedly also a sort of racist concern. And the racism is absolutely there. And of course, during the time of during the Nazi era, and in the late 19th century, it was absolutely straightforward and open. I mean, it was absolute. I mean, the Germans, the Nazis, literally always spoke about the Slavs as, undermentioned, lower, subhumans, people who weren't really proper Europeans in any real sense, and which was one of the reasons they were so violent against them. But there are two underlying reasons for this, beyond the sheer number of Slavs. The first is that the Slav languages are very distinct and different from those of Western Europe. Western European languages of Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Britain, are based on two roots: German and Latin. And Slav languages are not connected with either of those two. They're very different, and they're very difficult, by the way, for West Europeans to learn and understand. The number of West Europeans who are able to speak Slav languages is very, very few. And that immediately distinguishes the Slavs from the Westerners. The other thing about the Slavs is that in many cases, they have a distinct religious identity. The Eastern Slavs, the Russians, and the Southern Slavs in the Balkans are Orthodox, which may not seem so much in the Chinese world because these are all Christians. But in the world of Christianity, which is always divided and always feuding, it again makes them very suspicious and very different in some sort of way. So people are very hostile to that aspect of Slavdom as well. That they are, so they're culturally different, they're linguistically different, they're religiously different. And of course, today, again in the West, there is a conception, a feeling about the Slavs that they are socially conservative. This may be true of many Slavs. It's not so true of all of them. And it wasn't true either always. I mean, I would say, for example, that in the mid-20th century, the Slavs were actually in some ways more socially liberal than some West Europeans were. But today, they're seen as socially conservative, more likely to be religious, which again makes them suspect to West Europeans. And lastly, Slavs, for one reason or another, tend to be very patriotic and very connected to their countries and their societies, which again, some West Europeans and Atlanticists in general are deeply suspicious of. But all of this, as you quite rightly say, has developed a kind of racist dimension. And you could see that it's there in the rhetoric. And as I said, it's been there for a long time, certainly going back to the 19th century, and particularly strong, as I said, during the Nazi era.
Yeah. So, and then also there's some about the royal families, right? Isn't it the British royal families blame the death of the Tsar's family and the British. They were some intermarriage. I mean, there was some marriage there, and then when the Tsar fall, the British blame the Russians for that, or there was some conflict there as well, some hatred there, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, this is of course massively hypocritical as well, by the way. But the Romanov dynasty,
Romanov,
the
yeah.
royal family of Russia, and the royal family of Britain, the
Yeah.
Windsors, are very closely related to each other. So Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar of Russia, and George V, who was the king of Britain at that time, were cousins. I mean, they were members of the same family. And I should say that Nicholas spoke perfect Russian and perfect French, but his preferred language was English. And the language that he spoke to his wife in was English. Most people don't. His private letters and communications were written in English. Now, it's absolutely true that during the Russian Revolution, the Tsar and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks. They were well executed, murdered, call it what you will. And the royal family in Britain were very shocked, and they've always held it against the Russians that this happened, and the Bolsheviks in particular. And famously, it was a major reason why no British monarch would travel to Russia until the Romanovs were received proper burial, and Russia apologized for what it had done and all of that. But the reality is, everybody knows, and what I'm going to say is not controversial history, is that after the Russian Revolution, first the provisional government, the bourgeois government that was in power in Russia for a short time, and then the Bolshevik government, led by Lenin, contacted the British repeatedly and said to the British, look, we've got the king here, the Tsar here, we've got his family. We don't really know what to do with these people. We're worried that if they stay here, there might be an effort to restore them, and we can't accept that. Can you take them? Can you let them go into exile in Britain? Because they're related to your royal family, and that's the solution. And the British said no. And we now know that the person who insisted that the answer should be no was the king, King George V, Nicholas's cousin. And the reason he did that was because this was a time of great social unrest in Britain itself. And the king was worried, almost certainly without cause, that if the Tsar came to Britain with his family, the working class in Britain, who was sympathetic to the Soviets and hostile to Nicholas, would hold this against the king himself, and he might face political problems. So, in effect, the King of England betrayed him. And it was the King of England's betrayal that ended in the tragedy in which the Tsar and his family were killed. By the way, the Russians, I should say this just for a Chinese audience, the Russians have bitterly regretted, almost in the moment that the royal family was assassinated, the fact that they did that. This has been a major issue. The Soviet government felt very guilty about it. Lenin felt very guilty about it. They sort of pretended for a long time that it hadn't happened, all of those things. China dealt with this problem far, far better. So when the last emperor was finally arrested with his family, instead of doing what the Russians did, they put him through a re-education, and he became a citizen, and he was allowed to live in Beijing and look after his garden and all of that. And I mean, that was a much, much, much wiser, more humane and clever thing to do. And it's something where maybe the Chinese learned the lesson from the mistake the Russians made, or maybe it was just a reflection of Chinese culture, which is not to be vindictive in that kind of way.
That's interesting, and maybe that explains why the British are particularly hostile towards Russia in general,
Yeah.
right? There is this racist element to it, and plus this historical event that,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
Well, absolutely. And if we go back to the Slavs, I mean, of course, the great Slav nation is Russia, which is a superpower. And
Mhm.
one of the other reasons for this great suspicion of the Slavs, the non-Russian Slavs, is that there's always this worry that because they're Slavs, they will ultimately look towards the great Slav nation, which is Russia, and look to Russia to take their lead from Russia. So there's that play as well. And I think you're probably right. I think there is perhaps some explanation there of this extreme hostility that the British have to Russia, which is very difficult to understand at many levels.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to understand, but there's one more
The
thing.
Russians find it very difficult to understand.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things to understand about the Russians is that culturally they are very Anglophile. I mean, they read English novels and English books. Shakespeare is very popular in Russia. Sherlock Holmes is very popular in Russia. All of that, and Russian boys and girls in the 60s and 70s, sometimes to the annoyance of the Soviet authorities, were very keen on British rock music. The Beatles and all that. So I mean, it's much less so today, by the way. I mean, now that the Russians have seen how antagonistic to them the British really are. I mean, even amongst those kind of people, there's been a turning away from Britain. But as I said, the British attitude to Russia makes no sense, and it has been a colossal mistake and lost opportunity.
Yeah, this topic of Russian hate is an interesting one. I just find it fascinating. And Gonzalo Lira had an episode to explain, why Victoria Nuland has this hatred towards Russia, which I find also very interesting. But anyway, so it seems like different people have different reasons, but they all hate Russia. It seems to me. Okay. All right. The Middle East. So they are Israel has been and is bombing Rafah, and they will continue. They're using this 2,000 pounds bomb, the MK-84. It doesn't seem it's going to stop. My question is the U.S. going to continue no matter what Israel does? The U.S. is just going to let it go, let Israel continue, because now the European countries are not happy about this.
No.
More and more people are turning against this thing now, but U.S.
I,
is
I,
not. Right.
I think they will continue to support it for as long as it continues on the Israeli side. I mean, I think that we've now reached that point where even if the Biden administration were to stop now, the political damage within the United States amongst Biden's supporters has been done. And I think the president himself and the political and military industrial class in the United States continue to be completely committed to Israel. And the fact that there are now doubts in Europe, and the fact that there's been all these court decisions, the one from the International Criminal Court and the one from the International Court of Justice, I think all that they've done is harden American determination to stand by Israel. I think that the Americans are furious about those decisions because they were made in defiance of themselves. And I think that that's made them even more determined to support Israel in whatever it is that Israel now chooses to do.
Is it? I mean, there are some speculations in the Chinese media saying that Israel, because it's feel like it's cornered, it will do more extreme things. Like, for example, is there a possibility that will go beyond Gaza? They will keep on going. After all, they occupy the Sinai Peninsula twice, right? So that's one of the things happening now on the border between Egypt and Israel. There are some tensions there. So what do you think? I mean, there's a lot of talking about, oh, Russia is not just going to stop in Ukraine. They're going to, go further, etc. But there's no talking about that actually Israel can do that too. They can go beyond Gaza too. What do you think?
Well, I think that's entirely right. I think they can, and I think the rhetoric coming out of Israel is becoming very dangerous. And I think they might very well decide to go beyond Gaza. You mentioned Sinai. They have indeed occupied Sinai twice before. Of course, if they were to go to war with Egypt, that would be a tremendous escalation, and perhaps even too much of an escalation for this Israeli government. But Lebanon is an entirely different question. And there's a lot of talk from time to time of Israel escalating the war into Lebanon as well. And they might do that. And last but not least, we had that episode a few weeks ago when they bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus. We've now had, we then had the missile strikes that Iran and Israel launched against each other. And over the last couple of days, a very, very worrying thing has happened, which is that the Ukrainians made drone attacks against two big Russian radar systems in southern Russia, one at a place called Armavir and the other at a place called Orsk. And the point that has not been widely reported about these radars is that what they do is that they track the situation in the Middle East and they keep watch on Israeli ballistic missile launches. They're enormously powerful radars and they are what are called over the horizon radars. So they enable the Russians to know when the Israelis are launching ballistic missiles. And it's been mentioned that if Israel were to decide to launch a strike against Iran with ballistic missiles, the way to avoid the Russians identifying the fact that these missiles have been launched and warning the Iranians before the missiles come is to destroy those radars. Now, Ukraine and Israel have been coming closer together as Russia's relations with Israel have basically collapsed. And I have to say, with this very, very desperate, very dangerous Israeli government, I can easily imagine that they might want to try something like as reckless as this. For the record, I understand that one radar suffered a slight amount of damage, but that the other radar has been unaffected.
Yeah, you see, Jimmy Carter, who he talked quite a few times that the Camp David Accords is something he's very proud of, obviously. And I even saw him one time when my graduate school when we were when I was in graduate school, he come to my school give a speech, and he talked about too. He's very proud of the Camp David because he said after the Camp David Accord signed, two sides, none of them ever breached that even 1 inch. So he's very proud that it's not just a agreement signed, but it's also both sides will hold on their agree to it and they implement it. I just wonder now that a few days ago his grandsons have came out and said that there's not many days left for Jimmy Carter. So it will be interesting to see Camp David Accord will continue after his passing. We will see. I'm
Well,
not so
we will indeed
convinced.
see. Yeah. I mean, I personally think Camp David, by the way, was a disaster. I think it was a massive mistake. I
Mhm.
think that I can remember that time very well, which is the mid 1970s. And there was an international peace conference that was supposed to be convened to settle the crisis in the Middle East. And there was work to set it up in Geneva. And it was supposed to be co chaired by the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was a path towards peace in the Middle East. Israel didn't like it because the
Mhm.
Arab states would have been there, and so would the Russians. And there were some people in the United States didn't like it either for the same reasons. And what they managed to do was to persuade Egypt to break away from this idea of an international peace conference and agree a bilateral treaty with Israel. And I think that changed the balance of power in the Middle East. It was what made Israel so powerful relative to all the other Arab states, because the major Arab state, which was Egypt, was now in a peace treaty with Israel. And it was what led to this long wasted decades of unending Israeli aggression and Israeli expansion in the West Bank, which has brought us to the crisis that we are in. And we've now come full circle, because it's now becoming, I think, increasingly clear that this whole project of doing bilateral treaties between Israel and Arab states not only does not produce peace, it prolongs war.
Mhm.
And we've now see that the Arab states themselves and more countries have gradually come round to understand that the way to resolve this problem is through an international peace conference. Though now, this time, it is China, not the United States, and the Soviet Union, of course, is gone. It is China that is proposing it.
Yeah, you're right, because Trump also did this Abraham Accord, right? It
Yes.
doesn't really bring peace.
No.
It's also, bilateral, kind of multiple bilateral, but still, it's
No.
not like the whole region, everybody's involved and get along, get some kind of agreement for the whole region. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes more sense now. Yeah. And Israel, in the meantime, is declaring UN. They have the intention to declare UN a terrorist organization. I mean, what are they thinking?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, they are. I think they're going. I think that they're losing their minds. Actually, I think they know that they're losing, and I think that they understand that the global balance of power is shifting against them. And I mean, just as the Americans are going mad over China becoming powerful, as we discussed at the start of the program, the Israelis are going mad because they sense that the project to create Greater Israel is failing, and failing fast, and that the entire future of Israel is now in question.
Yeah, Wilkinson, right? Lawrence Wilkinson was on your show, right?
Yeah.
He actually said something like that. He said, "I'm not sure within the next 20 years, Israel will continue to exist, as a country."
Yeah.
So yeah, I think
I agree with him, by the way,
yeah,
about this.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think more
Israel
people.
is living dangerously. I don't know
Mhm,
whether they understand that, but they are.
yeah. Okay, something light. Um, Trump's VP pick, I find interesting. So, uh, right now the top contender is Tom Cotton. We can go to Tom Cotton later, but it
God
seems
help
like
us.
Nikki Haley is on there, and there was another woman, Kristen Noem, who was I think South Dakota or South Dakota governor. Now, these are people, one is more crazy than the other.
Yeah.
See, Christian Norm, she wrote a book. The reason she is no longer in the contender list is because she wrote this book. In the book, describe an event that she was killing her dog. In a very brutal way, she killed her dog. And not only that, she killed a goat right after that. That in front of her neighbors, just she did that. And the neighbor was so scared, they ran into their own house because they thought they were the next, and she wrote all that in her book. So this
Yeah.
is a crazy woman in my view.
Yeah.
And Nikki Haley, just recently, like yesterday, she signed a bomb, her name on a bomb, and said something like "finish them."
Yeah.
What's going on with all these women? Sometimes I find in politics, women are more crazy than men. They have to do things even more extreme than men. Is that what it is?
It is absolutely true. I don't understand it myself. Once upon a time, I had this naive idea, I think many of us did,
Yeah.
that one of the reasons there was so much belligerence and violence in the world is because there weren't enough women in politics.
Oh yeah.
And,
Absolutely.
I really did believe that. And maybe it's still true. But what we have in the meantime are these, terrifying people who basically psychopaths. I mean, that's the only way I can describe them, actually.
Kamala Harris also is another scary one. Even
Yeah.
though, I mean, I didn't know much about her until I read the Colin Maupin. He wrote a book, the RT journalist, and he wrote a book about her. It's awful. It's absolutely awful. I'm not sure he's better than Joe Biden. As scary as
No,
Joe Biden is, I
no.
don't want Kamala Harris to replace him. It's
Well,
horrifying.
quite.
Yeah. Now, how do you feel about Tom Cotton? He's another hawkish guy, right? Isn't it? So, so is he? I mean, well, who do you think should be a better, who could be a good candidate for Trump's
Well,
VP?
well, I mean, there's the question of who I would like to be, whom I personally would like to see as Vice President of the United States. He's never going to choose any of the people I want, but Tulsi Gabbard,
Uh-huh.
just one
Yeah.
person people have talked about. Why not?
Yeah.
She talks rationally and sanely about foreign policy. When the American people, especially younger people, see her, they like her, they warm to her, and that is one possible person. I'm
Yeah.
sure there's lots of others. JD Vance
Hmm.
talked very sensibly and sanely about foreign policy and all of these things. I mean, I saw that he's now another person who's coming out, and he started. I mean, he used to be a China hawk, but he now seems to be moderating his position on that also. I think he's apparently come round to an understanding that this does not serve the true interests of the American people or of the United States. So, there's people like that, and they do exist, and they can be found in the political system. But I think it's absolutely clear now that Donald Trump is looking for somebody completely different. He's looking for someone as hardline as he could possibly get. And Tom Cotton, it seems to me, is very hardline. He's hardline on Israel and the Palestinian issue. He's hardline on Russia, relentlessly so. And he's hardline on China too. And Trump, again, is being drawn towards these kind of people, as he was when he was president, when he ended up with John Bolton as national security advisor. And all that it will do is it will lead to further disaster when he is president, because these people don't trust Trump and don't really like him and will work to undermine him. And in the meantime, if Trump does want to make any changes to foreign policy, he'll find that he can't.
Yeah, it seems like even the fact that he's Nikki Haley is still on the running for being
Yeah.
the VP, because they seem to really hate each other, don't like each other, and Trump said
Yeah.
it that he will never pick her, but she's still in the running. I read that part of the reason is Nikki Haley seems like the candidate for the neocons,
Yeah.
neoliberals, those deep state
Yeah.
people, and they were pushing hard on
Yeah.
Trump to take her,
Yeah.
or I guess possibly Tom Cotton is also they approve. It seems
Yeah.
like they need to approve whoever Trump pick
Yeah.
before Trump.
Well, that's right. And I suspect they're also leveraging all these court cases to put pressure on Trump in order to try to get him to agree to one of these individuals. I mean, I think what he will find if he goes along with what they want is that he won't have chosen his vice president. He'll have chosen the person who's going to take over from him. Because that's what's going to happen. They'll find some way to get Trump out of the picture. They might keep him as president, but the effective power will pass to the vice president. Or they might impeach him all over again. I mean, they've tried twice. Why not a third time? They could do all kinds of things. And they will simply end up picking the person they want, not for the presidency, because Trump is likely to be the next president, but for the vice, but ultimately for the presidency through the vice presidency instead. I mean, that's the mechanism. I mean, he will seal his political fate if he does that.
Yeah, it seems like one way they can do it is that they will just, like you said, that they can impeach him, they can with this trial, that trial, just keep him very busy, right? And then in
Yeah,
the meantime, they get whatever they want to do. They keep on
exactly,
wars
exactly,
here and war there. Yeah. Okay.
exactly.
Yeah. And that's why I guess in the end the election doesn't really matter that much. Seems to me like.
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's this. It's one of those. I mean, the thing about there was one of the Duran commentators, one of the people who writes to me, put this so well. He says, there's never any doubt about what the people in America want, and he was writing to me. He's a Republican. He said, we elected a Republican Congress, a House of Representatives, and look what we got. We're trying to elect a Republican president, and look what we're going to get. Whatever we do, we end up exactly where we were when we started. And this isn't democracy. It's the opposite of democracy. It's its abolition.
And I used to be a big fan of Hillary Clinton,
Yeah.
talking about a women leader. And the more I read
So
about
was
her,
I.
the more I read about her, the less I like her. And then I find actually I like her better when she was the first lady versus as soon as she becomes a senator, she seems started to change. And then when she started running, I don't know. When she's running against Donald Trump, I just gradually come to really dislike her,
Absolutely.
So,
I mean, the sort of thing, I remember Hillary Clinton when she was first lady, and I liked her a lot at that time. I was a huge admirer of her. I didn't particularly like her husband. I always found him rather slippery. But I thought that she was always, in the end, the more impressive of the two. And at the time of Clinton's impeachment, I was, very sympathetic to Hillary, and I thought that she dealt with the whole situation, the very embarrassing situation of her husband's impeachment, very well.
Yeah.
And as you absolutely rightly say, she started that way, and she became a monster. Apparently, that's what Washington does to people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's something wrong with our system in a way, right? When you have even Nancy Pelosi, when she first got into Washington, she wasn't like this. She wasn't as corrupt as she is now.
No.
She was a different type of, I would say, more ideological, more believing things.
Yes.
Nowadays, they don't believe anything. They just believe in money and power, and that's it, right? And,
yes. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, we will see what happens, who Trump will pick. That'll be interesting. We'll see.
It will indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.
Well, my pleasure as well. We'll speak next week. See you then. Have a great week.